They say that on the day of her trial, the air in the Russellville courthouse was thick with hate. The good people of Kentucky wanted a hanging. They saw Sally Rice Harper not as a woman, but as a demon's consort, the bride of a monster whose bloody deeds had terrorized the frontier. Yet when she spoke, frail and broken, her testimony of the horrors she'd endured was so chilling it swayed a jury sworn to convict her. She walked free, a survivor who looked a devil in the eye and lived. But the question that haunted the courtroom that day still echoes through the hollows. Was she the ultimate victim or the ultimate performer? To understand the woman in that courtroom, you have to travel back, before the blood and the fear, to the hard-packed dirt floor of a minister's cabin in Knox County, Tennessee. This was Sally Rice's world, a tiny island of order carved out of a vast, chaotic wilderness. Her father, John Rice, was a Methodist minister, a man who fought the frontier's savagery not with a long rifle, but with the Holy Bible. He built her a life fenced in by scripture and piety, where the days were measured by chores and prayer, and a woman's virtue was her most precious possession. Life on the edge of civilization was a brutal teacher. Every day was a lesson in hardship. Winters were lean, sickness was a constant shadow, and the threat of violence from man or beast was as real as the cold mountain wind. Sally was raised to be tough, resourceful, and obedient. She knew how to mend clothes, tend a garden, and stretch a meal to feed one more mouth. But more than anything, she was taught the rigid morality of her father's faith, that the world was a clear battle between good and evil, and a righteous path was the only shield against damnation. But a fence, no matter how strong, can't stop the sounds from the world outside. Through the cracks in her father's rigid world, Sally would have glimpsed another life. She saw the rough-hewn hunters and trappers who passed through, men who lived by their own code, their eyes holding a freedom and a danger she couldn't comprehend. She heard the whispers of tavern brawls, of land disputes settled with a knife, of fortunes made and lost on the turn of a card. These were glimpses of a world that didn't fit neatly into her father's sermons, a world painted in shades of grey. The code her father preached was one of forgiveness, community, and the rule of law. But the mountains had an older, harsher code. It was a code of absolute self-reliance, where an insult to your honor was a debt that could only be paid in blood. It was a code where family was paramount and survival was the only true law. Sally stood with a foot in both worlds. She was her father's daughter, raised in the light, but she was also a child of the frontier, surrounded by an encroaching darkness she was taught to fear, but must have also been secretly curious about. We don't have a record of one single event that defined her youth, but you can imagine a moment that planted a seed of restlessness in her soul. Perhaps it was a traveling merchant, his saddlebags full of colorful cloth and even more colorful stories of cities like Charleston or New Orleans. As he spoke, he might have painted a picture of a world so vast and vibrant that her father's small congregation seemed like a cage. In that moment, the righteous path might have started to feel less like a shield and more like a tether. And so, Sally Rice was a paradox long before the Harps ever laid eyes on her. She was a woman of God, taught to be meek and obedient, yet possessed the quiet resilience that only the frontier can forge. She was steeped in a morality of black and white, but lived on the border of a lawless land where the only color that mattered was the deep red of blood. This internal conflict was the fault line running through her soul, and when the Harper brothers arrived, they were the earthquake that would finally tear her world apart. History doesn't give us a diary from Sally Rice, no collection of letters detailing her hopes and dreams. But we can piece together the life she must have lived, the world that was stolen from her. In the years before the storm, she wasn't a legend or a ghost. She was simply a daughter, a neighbor, and a cornerstone of her father's small, devout community. Her life was one of quiet, relentless purpose. Her hands were rarely still, whether kneading dough for the Sunday communion bread, stitching a quilt for a neighbor's newborn, or tending to the sick with a poultice of herbs her mother had taught her to find. In the eyes of her community, Sally was the very picture of respectable frontier womanhood, pious, diligent, and modest. Young men, clearing their own patches of land and dreaming of starting a family, would have looked upon her with a deep and sober respect. She was the kind of woman you could build a life with, one who would stand by you through harsh winters and uncertain harvests. She was a promise of stability in a world that offered very little of it. Her relationships were woven into the very fabric of this small settlement. There was the deep, if perhaps demanding, love for her father, a man whose approval was her guiding star. There was the easy camaraderie with the other women, a bond forged over shared labors at the washing creek and whispered conversations by the hearth. This wasn't just a place she lived, it was an identity. She was John Rice's daughter, a good Christian woman, a future wife and mother. Her name was clean, her path was clear, and her future seemed as solid as the Appalachian mountains themselves. This was the world at stake. Not a great fortune or a vast tract of land, but something far more precious. A good name, a place in her community, and a future unburdened by shame. It was a simple, fragile world, built on faith and mutual reliance, where the sound of hymns on a Sunday morning could, for a little while, drown out the howl of a wolf in the woods. This was the life Sally Rice knew, a world of simple decency and hard-won peace. And it was about to be burned to the ground. But in every fortress, there is a weak point, and in every soul, a hidden crack. For all her piety and obedience, Sally Rice harbored a fatal flaw, one common to so many people trapped in a life they did not choose, a deep and restless curiosity. It was a yearning for a world larger than the one she could see from her father's doorstep, a hunger for a story that wasn't already written for her in the pages of a hymn book. She was a good daughter, but a part of her spirit chafed under the bit of rigid righteousness. There's a story, a piece of local law that never made it into the official records, that speaks to this hidden side of Sally. They say that sometimes, when she was supposed to be gathering firewood or checking rabbit snares, she would instead climb the highest ridge behind her family's cabin. Up there, clinging to the rocky outcrop, with the wind whipping her hair, she could see the world unfold. Valley after valley, painted in shades of blue and green, stretching out to a horizon that seemed to promise everything and nothing all at once. It was a small, secret act of defiance, a moment of tasting a freedom her father would have called a sin. This hunger for the horizon was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave her a resilience, an inner strength to endure the monotony and hardship of her daily life. But on the other, it made her dangerously naive. She craved experience so badly that she lacked the wisdom to judge its character. She could see the allure of the unknown, but she was utterly blind to its perils. Her father had built a wall of faith around her to protect her from the world's evils, but in doing so, he had left her with no weapons to fight them should they ever breach the walls. And so the crack in her armor was not malice or wickedness, but a deep and dangerous yearning. She was a bird in a well-made cage who spent her days dreaming of the sky, never once considering that the sky was also home to hawks. When the Harp brothers eventually rode into her life, they were not just men. They were the embodiment of that wild, untamed horizon she had only ever glimpsed from the top of a mountain. And her flaw, her desperate curiosity, would prevent her from seeing the shadow of the hawk until its talons were already sunk deep into her flesh. They didn't arrive like a storm, but like a low, unsettling rumble on the horizon. Two men emerging from the deep woods on horseback, their figures dark against the tree line. They approached the rice cabin, not with the caution of strangers, but with an unnerving ownership, as if the entire frontier belonged to them. The smaller man, Wiley, was wiry and watchful, but it was the giant Micajah Harp who seemed to suck the very air from the clearing. He was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of hardened leather and dark scowls, and he carried himself with the predatory grace of a bear. Minister John Rice, bound by the sacred frontier code of hospitality, met them at the door. He offered them water and a place to rest their horses, his voice steady with the authority of a man of God. But Big Harp's gaze passed right over him. His eyes, dark and possessing, settled on Sally. And in that moment, the unforgivable affront occurred. It wasn't a shouted threat or a drawn weapon. It was in the way Harp looked at her, not as a person, but as a prize, a piece of property he had just discovered and intended to claim. In his stare, all of her father's laws, all of God's commandments, were dismissed as meaningless. For Sally, this should have been a moment of pure terror. Her father's world was being challenged by a raw, masculine power that was its complete opposite. But her fatal flaw, that restless curiosity, flared to life. This man was not like the shuffling, deferential farm boys from the congregation. He was the wilderness given human form. He was dangerous. He was chaos. He was real in a way that felt more potent than any sermon she had ever heard. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of fascination. This was the spark. The choice that history has debated ever since wasn't really a choice at all. The myth says he seduced her with promises of adventure. The official record says he dragged her screaming from the cabin. The truth likely lies in the murky space between. Perhaps he spoke a few words to her, his voice a low growl that promised to show her that horizon she'd always dreamed of. And perhaps for one foolish, fatal second, she listened. Her curiosity, for the briefest of moments, outweighed her fear. That hesitation was all the opening Big Harp needed. The seduction, if there ever was one, ended there. The instant she was within his reach, the mask of the charismatic rogue fell away to reveal the monster beneath. The affront that began with a look was completed with an act of brutal possession. He grabbed her, and the spell was shattered. The dream of the horizon instantly became the nightmare of a cage on wheels. Her father's shouts, her mother's screams, they became the fading sounds of a world she had just lost forever. The fuse had been lit, not by a grand battle, but by a single damning look and a young woman's naive hunger for a life she was never meant to know. The romance of the horizon, if it ever existed, died within the first mile. Sally Rice's new world was the sweaty flank of a horse, the hard ground at night, and the constant suffocating presence of Big Harp. The warnings were not whispered words from concerned friends, they were actions, each one a brutal lesson in the nature of the beasts who now owned her. The first time Big Harp backhanded her for being too slow to make camp, the shock of it was a deafening bell toll, signaling the end of her old life. This was not an escape. It was a new and more terrible cage. The first door to a life she might have salvaged slammed shut on the banks of a Kentucky river. They had fallen in with a traveler, a man named Langford, who shared his meager rations with them. For a few hours, the conversation was almost normal, a fleeting reminder of common decency. Sally might have felt a flicker of hope. Then, without a word of warning, little Harp's tomahawk came down. The sound, a wet, sickening crack, echoed in the sudden silence. Sally watched, paralyzed, as they looted his body and casually rolled it into the brush. In that moment, she learned the most important rule of her new life. Any kindness shown to her was a death sentence for the one who showed it. To cry for help was to murder the helper. Opportunities to flee must have presented themselves, each one a poisoned chalice. Perhaps one night, with the brothers passed out from a jug of stolen whiskey, she stood at the edge of the firelight, the dark woods promising escape. But where would she go? The wilderness that had once seemed a symbol of freedom was now an accomplice to her captivity, an endless maze of shadows filled with predators, both animal and human. To run was to choose a different, slower death. So she stayed, banking the fire, her inaction a choice made for her by the absolute certainty of what lay in wait, both in the woods around her and in the sleeping forms of the men behind her. With every passing week, her old self, the minister's daughter, began to die a quiet death. The path of no compromise was not a refusal to back down from a fight. It was a total submission to the logic of survival. She learned to read Big Harp's moods in the set of his jaw, to anticipate Wiley's twitchy violence. She learned to make herself small, to be useful, to become a piece of the scenery. Her prayers at night, if she still dared to offer them, must have changed. She no longer prayed for rescue, but for the strength to endure another sunrise. She was not alone in her misery, but the presence of the other women, Susan and Betsy, offered no comfort. They were not sisters in arms, planning a rebellion. They were three separate souls trapped in the same hell, each one a rival for the sliver of tolerance that might spare them a beating. Their shared glances were not of solidarity, but of mutual, desolate understanding. They were a tribe of the damned, and their silence was a pact of survival that isolated each of them completely. The warnings had all been ignored because they were impossible to heed. Each murder she witnessed, each body filled with stones and sunk in a cold river, was another chain binding her to the gang. She was no longer just an innocent captive in her own mind. The blood had spattered too close. The path back to her father's world was turning to ash behind her. To leave now, even if she could, would be to carry the stench of their crimes with her, branding her forever. Her only path forward was the one the Harps carved through the frontier, a trail of blood leading deeper and deeper into a darkness from which there was no return. It came on a humid afternoon at a small, fly-blown trading post on the Green River. For a few brief hours, the world felt almost normal. The Harps were trading stolen furs for salt and lead, their violent energy momentarily focused on the simple act of commerce. Sally, Susan, and Betsy were allowed a few feet of freedom, lingering near a rack of iron pots. It was here that a ghost from her past appeared, a kindly, whiskered man named Gable, who had once supplied her father's community with tools and news from the outside world. He saw her, and his face, weathered and friendly, froze in disbelief. He approached cautiously, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and alarm. "Sally," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Sally Rice. Child, is that you?" For a heartbeat, the sound of her own name, spoken with kindness, was a physical blow. It was the name of a girl who was dead, a ghost she had long since buried. Hope, a feeling so dangerous she'd forgotten what it felt like, flickered in her chest. Mr. Gable saw the flicker. He leaned closer, his words a desperate, urgent plea. "Your father has been sick with worry. Everyone thinks you're dead. My wagon is just behind the storehouse. I'm leaving at first light, heading east. I can hide you under the canvas. I can take you home, Sally. We can get you home." It was the off-ramp, a clear, well-lit path leading directly out of hell. All she had to do was take his hand, and in that moment, she saw it all play out. She would run. The Harps would notice. Their good mood would curdle into volcanic rage. They would catch the wagon before it cleared the next ridge. They wouldn't just take her back. They would take Mr. Gable, this good and decent man, and they would make him pay for his kindness in ways she couldn't bear to imagine. His blood would be on her hands, another victim of her tainted existence. She looked from his hopeful, pleading face to the hulking form of Big Harp, who was now laughing with the trader, a sound more menacing than any threat. The flicker of hope in her chest was deliberately, painfully extinguished. She had been a prisoner for so long that she now understood its cruelest logic. To save the innocent, you must remain among the damned. She straightened her back, and when she met Mr. Gable's eyes again, they were as cold and empty as a winter sky. "You are mistaken, sir," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My name is not Sally." She turned her back on him, on her name, on the last chance she would ever have for salvation, and walked calmly back to the monsters she now called her own. The crossroads had been presented, and she had chosen her path. The reckoning came not in a hail of gunfire or a clash of knives, but in a miserable rain-soaked camp on a cold night. The world had shrunk to the size of a weak, sputtering fire, casting dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. The only sound, other than the miserable drizzle, was the thin, relentless wail of a newborn. It was Susan Wood's infant daughter, a child born into a life of flight and fear, and her crying was like a needle, stitching itself directly into the frayed nerves of Big Harp. He sat staring into the flames, his massive shoulders hunched. He wasn't enraged, not in the way a normal man would be. It was something colder, a deep and profound irritation, the annoyance of a god swatting at a fly. Susan, her face pale and gaunt in the firelight, rocked the child, whispering useless reassurances, her every movement radiating a desperate animal terror. She knew, and they all knew, that in this world, any sound of weakness was an invitation to violence. Then he rose. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a hulking shadow detaching itself from the others. He walked over to Susan, not looking at her, but at the source of the noise. Sally's breath caught in her throat, a cold stone lodging itself in her chest. The world seemed to slow down, every detail sharpening into painful focus. The glint of firelight on his wet hair, the dead expression in his eyes, the way Susan flinched, trying to make herself and her child invisible. He reached down. A shot of motion, too quick to comprehend, cut through the night. The crying, which had been the constant pulse of the camp's misery, stopped. It didn't fade. It was just gone. It was replaced by a single sickening sound that the rain almost swallowed. And then, an absolute, profound silence that was 1,000 times louder than the baby's wail had ever been. In that silence, the world had fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Susan Wood's face, which had been a mask of fear, simply collapsed. Her mouth opened in a perfect silent O of horror, but no scream came out. She had seen an act so far beyond the boundaries of human cruelty that her own body couldn't even process the sound it demanded. The tiny bundle she had been desperately trying to quiet was no longer in her arms. From her place across the fire, Sally watched, and a part of her soul turned to ice and shattered. This was the ultimate truth of her captivity. This was not a man driven by greed or revenge. This was a force of nature, a void where a soul should be. She understood then that there was no line he would not cross, no act too monstrous. The argument that had raged between a fragile new life and a world of pure malice was suddenly, permanently over. He turned and walked back to his spot by the fire, as if he had done nothing more than toss a log on the flames. The drizzle continued to fall, hissing in the embers, washing away the evidence of a life that had barely begun. The chilling silence that followed was the sound of a new law being written, one that Sally now understood completely. To survive, you had to be quieter than the dead. After the night of the silent baby, the world of the Harp gang became a waking purgatory. The air was thick with a new kind of fear, a brittle, silent dread. The women moved like ghosts, their faces hollowed out, their eyes vacant. Even the harps seemed to feel it. Their brutal confidence was curdling into a cornered animal's paranoia. They were no longer hunters, they were prey. The entire frontier had become a vast posse, and every rustle of leaves, every distant dog's bark, was the sound of the world closing in. For Sally, the terror was no longer about what Big Harp might do to her, but about the violent end she now knew was coming for all of them. The final chase was a grim, exhausted flight through the dense canebrakes of western Kentucky. They were running not to escape, but just to delay the inevitable. Then, one hot August morning, the inevitable arrived. It came as a shout from the woods, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats and the crack of long rifles. The posse, led by the vengeful Moses Stegel, descended upon their camp like a righteous flood. Chaos erupted. Sally and the other women scrambled for cover, becoming spectators to the final bloody act of the drama they'd been forced to star in. She saw Big Harp try to make a stand, saw him leveled by a shot that shattered his spine. He fell not like a giant, but like a puppet with its strings cut. As the posse swarmed his crippled, roaring form, Sally watched with a profound and chilling detachment. There was no joy, no relief, only a vast, hollow emptiness. She saw Moses Stegel, his face a mask of cold fury, kneel beside the dying monster. She watched the slow, deliberate work of the knife. And when Stegel raised Harp's head by its matted hair, a gruesome trophy against the morning sky, Sally felt no horror. She had already witnessed the murder of an innocent. This, by comparison, was just the slaughter of a beast. Her state of mind in that moment was not triumph or regret. It was a complete and total exhaustion of the soul. The nightmare was over, but she was not awake. She simply stood by a sycamore tree, dirt-streaked and numb, as the men of the posse, their bloodlust sated, finally turned their attention to the women. A hand, rough but not brutal, took her by the arm. It wasn't the possessive, violent grip of Big Harp. It was the cold, impersonal grip of the law. And in that moment, her life on the run was officially over. She didn't fight. She didn't speak. She simply allowed herself to be led away. For 2 years, she had lived under the absolute tyranny of one man's will. Now, she was a prisoner of another system, one with courthouses and judges instead of campfires and tomahawks. The end of the road had come, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a new and perhaps even more difficult journey was just beginning. While Sally Rice Harper was being led away in chains, the news of her survival began its slow, cruel journey back to her father's cabin in Tennessee. The message was a paradox of relief and damnation. Your daughter is alive, but she is the devil's wife. For Minister John Rice, the man who had built his life on the bedrock of piety and reputation, this was a blow from which he would never recover. The shame was a physical presence in his home, a stain on the family name that no amount of prayer could wash out. His congregation looked at him with pity, but also with suspicion. How could such evil have sprung from the house of God? The wreck of Big Harp's life was not his alone. It had washed up on his doorstep and poisoned the well of his life's work. The damage radiated outward, far beyond one family's shame. The Harp's reign of terror had fundamentally broken the frontier's most sacred code, the code of hospitality. Before their rampage, a stranger at your door was a guest to be fed. After, a stranger was a potential murderer. The trust that held these isolated communities together was shattered. Families who had once shared tools and salt now barred their doors at night, their long rifles kept closer at hand. The Wilderness Road, once a symbol of hope and a pathway to a new life, became a 2-year-long funeral procession, and its reputation was now one of ambush and unmarked graves. The land itself seemed to bear the scars. A certain bend in the river was no longer just a good fishing spot. It was the place they'd sunk John Tully's body. A particular patch of woods was not just timber, it was where the posse had finally cornered the beast. And for years to come, a lonely crossroads in Kentucky would be known only for the grotesque, rotting head of Micajah Harp impaled on a pike, a landmark of frontier justice that served as a permanent reminder of the horror that had passed through. The geography of the region had been rewritten, its landmarks now serving as tombstones. And then there were the other families, the ones whose names were not tied to the killers, but to the victims. For the wives, children, and parents of men like Thomas Langford and John Graves, the death of Big Harp brought no closure. It only cemented their loss. Their lives were now defined by an empty chair at the table, by a future that had been stolen by a moment of senseless, random violence. The Harps' legacy was not just in their own death and infamy, but in the countless quiet tragedies they left in their wake, in the dozens of families whose stories were now permanently rerouted down a path of grief and hardship. The tragedy of the Harper brothers, you see, did not end when a knife sawed through Big Harp's neck. That was simply the end of the killing. The true wreckage was in the survivors, in the communities paralyzed by fear, and in the shadow of suspicion that would fall over Sally Rice's family for a generation. The violence was a stone thrown into the placid pool of the frontier, and its ripples would disturb the waters for decades to come. The Russellville courthouse was little more than a log cabin with a judge's bench. But on the day Sally and the other women were brought to trial, it was the center of the universe. It was packed to the rafters with the husbands, sons, and brothers of the Harp's victims, their faces grim, their hands resting on the butts of the pistols in their belts. This was not a crowd seeking justice. They were a congregation demanding a sacrifice. To them, these women were not captives. They were the devil's brood, witches who had lured good men to their deaths. The air was thick with a righteous, murderous hum. This was the ultimate clash of cultures. The court, with its powdered wigs and leather-bound books, operated on the principles of evidence and testimony, of a world governed by man's law. But Sally's defense was based on an unwritten, brutal code that no one in that room, save the other two women, could truly understand. The mountain code of absolute survival. The prosecutor's questions were logical, but to Sally, they were absurd. "Why didn't you try to escape?" he would thunder. How could she explain that escape meant a slower death by starvation or a quicker one upon recapture? Why did you not cry for help? How could she describe the cold certainty that her cry would be a death sentence for whoever was foolish enough to listen? Here, in the crucible of the courtroom, Sally Rice Harper gave the performance of her life. She did not stand tall and defiant. She was the very picture of a broken victim. Frail, emaciated, her voice a fragile whisper, she painted a picture of unendurable horror. She spoke of her abduction, of the constant beatings, of the soul-crushing fear that was her daily bread. She understood her audience perfectly, a jury of stern, patriarchal frontiersmen who believed in the inherent weakness and moral purity of women. She could not be their equal. She had to be their ward, a fallen dove in need of their protection. Her trump card, the story that would save her life, was the murder of Susan Wood's infant daughter. As she recounted the tale, a hush fell over the hostile courtroom. She described the baby's relentless crying, Big Harp's cold annoyance, and the final sickening moment of silence. She looked at the 12 grim-faced men on the jury, her eyes brimming with tears she had learned to summon on command, or perhaps they were horrifyingly real. What chance, her voice cracked, did an unarmed woman have against a beast who would snatch his own child from her mother's arms and silence her against a tree? That single, horrific image shattered the prosecution's case. It was a truth so monstrous it transcended legal arguments. In that moment, the men on the jury no longer saw an accomplice. They saw their own wives, their own daughters, and imagined them in the grip of such an inhuman force. The code of the mountains, the law of survival, had finally been translated into a language the court could understand. It was the language of pure, unrestrained evil, an evil against which they reasoned no woman could possibly stand. The verdict, when it came, was a shock that rippled through the courtroom. Not guilty. Sally Rice was acquitted. A murmur of disbelief and anger went through the crowd, but the law had spoken. True justice, however, remained an open question. Was this a triumph of empathy, a rare moment where a court understood the realities of coercion and abuse? Or was it the ultimate con, a masterful manipulation by a hardened survivor who knew exactly what a roomful of men needed to hear to let her go free? The law had rendered its judgment, but the mountains and the whispers of the people who lived in them would keep their own verdict for centuries to come. While Sally walked free, the story of the Harps was not yet fully written. The main antagonist, the hulking Big Harp, had already met a gruesome end, his head left to the sun and the crows. But the other side of that evil coin, his brother wily Little Harp, had cheated the hangman's rope. Before he could be tried and executed, he and Betsy Roberts managed to escape the flimsy Russellville jail, slipping through the bars like a shadow and vanishing back into the wilderness that had spawned them. The law had failed. The monster was not dead. It had merely shed its skin. For a time, little Harp prospered in the only way he knew how. He changed his name, calling himself John Seton, and fell in with another notorious gang of river pirates led by Samuel Mason. He went right back to a life of robbery and murder along the Natchez Trace, proving that the evil was not just in his brother, but was a deep and shared corruption. He found a new pack to run with, and for a while it seemed as if he might just get away with it all, a ghost of the frontier's greatest nightmare, still preying on the innocent. But the story of Wiley Harp ends with a final bitter twist of irony. It wasn't a lawman's rifle or a judge's gavel that ended his story. It was greed. A large bounty was placed on the head of his new leader, Samuel Mason. Seeing an opportunity, Harp and another outlaw conspired to murder Mason and claim the reward money. They brought Mason's severed head to the authorities in Mississippi, expecting a hero's welcome and a heavy purse. But a witness there recognized them, not as heroes, but as wanted outlaws in their own right. Wiley Harp had come to claim the bounty on another man's head, only to have the price put on his own. He was captured, tried, and finally sentenced to hang. His end came in January of 1804. After the execution, in a grim echo of his brother's fate, his own head was cut off and impaled on a pike along the Natchez Trace as a warning to other outlaws. There was no simple victory of good over evil here. Little Harp was brought down by his own boundless avarice, a victim of the same brutal, self-serving code he had lived by. The scales of justice were balanced not by a noble hand, but by the weight of a bag of silver, proving that in the violent garden of the frontier, sometimes the only thing that could kill a snake was another, hungrier snake. For Sally Rice, freedom was not a celebration, it was a disappearing act. She walked out of that courthouse and straight into the arms of a man named John Davis, a farmer who, for reasons lost to history, was willing to take a chance on a woman with a past as dark as a Kentucky cave. She became Mrs. Davis, a name as plain and sturdy as a split-rail fence, and settled in Logan County. She had more children, raised them, and worked her fingers to the bone, trying to build a wall of ordinary days high enough to block the view of the horrors she had seen. But you can't outrun your own shadow. She could change her name, but she couldn't change her face. For the rest of her life, she must have lived with the sideways glances at the market, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Every new friendship was a risk, every question about her past a carefully navigated minefield. Her life was a performance of normalcy, an endless effort to prove she was just a farmer's wife, not the woman who had shared a campfire with monsters. Her descendants, the Davises, grew up under the weight of a story that was never fully told, a quiet, unspoken tension in their family's foundation. The most haunting legacy, however, was a ghost. During her time with the Harps, Sally had given birth to a daughter, a child fathered by one of the brothers. What became of this baby, this innocent soul born of such a demonic union? History offers no answer. Did she die on the trail, another forgotten victim? Did Sally, in an act of desperate love, give the child away to a stranger to grant her a life free of the Harp name? Or did she raise the child in secret, constantly looking for the father's darkness in her daughter's eyes? This lost child is the true, aching heart of Sally's tragedy, a life that began and ended in a question mark. The community, too, sought to heal itself through a deep and profound silence. The Harp affair was not something to be discussed in polite company. The facts were too sharp, too painful, so they were smoothed down into a scary story to frighten children into behaving. People rebuilt, they planted crops, they raised families, but the memory of the Harpers became a part of the landscape, a permanent scar hidden just beneath the surface. They didn't heal by confronting the past, They healed by burying it alive, hoping its ghost would not find its way back to the surface. But of course, it always does. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges of history. In Webster County, Kentucky, there is a quiet country lane called Harp's Head Road. Today, it's just a stretch of asphalt where people drive to work and kids ride their bikes. But the name is a deep and permanent scar on the map, a physical reminder of the monster who was brought to justice nearby. His evil was so profound it literally branded the land. His name is a shout, an eternal warning. But if you go looking for a monument to Sally Rice Harper, you won't find one. There is no Sally's Ridge or Rice's Run. She is buried somewhere in Logan County under a simple weathered tombstone that likely bears the name Davis, a name that was not her curse, but her shield. Her greatest monument is her own successful disappearance, her deliberate fading into the background of history. She ran from her own name, and in a way, she succeeded. Yet her story never truly died. It didn't become a heroic ballad sung by firelight. It became something darker, a piece of grim local folklore, a cautionary tale told to young women about the charismatic danger that can hide behind a handsome face, or the terrifying speed at which a life can come undone. She became a ghost in the machine of the harp legend, the most haunting and ambiguous figure in a story filled with simple, brutal men. And so, her spirit haunts those mountains in a way that is far more subtle and unsettling than that of the harps. Their evil is a known quantity, a black hole of violence. Her ghost is the question that lingers in the quiet places. When you stand on a high ridge overlooking those old hills, you can almost feel it. While Big Harp's name is a shout of infamy, Sally's is a whisper in the pines, the ghost of a choice, a question that the wind still asks in the high, lonely places. Was she the innocent dove or the clever serpent? So we return to the question that hung in the air of that Russellville courthouse. Was Sally Rice Harper the ultimate victim or the ultimate performer? The truth, as it so often does in these old mountains, refuses to be so simple. She was undeniably a victim, a young woman stolen from her world and subjected to 2 years of unimaginable horror. But to survive the judgment of men after surviving the cruelty of monsters, she had to become a performer. She took the most traumatic event of her life, the murder of an innocent baby, and fashioned it into a key to unlock her own cage. Her performance was not a lie, it was the horrifying truth, weaponized. In the end, this is a story about the terrible, soul-altering cost of survival. It's a lesson in what happens when an ordinary person is thrown into a world of absolute evil and is forced to learn its brutal logic to see another sunrise. To live, Sally had to bury a part of herself so deep it might never have returned. She had to learn to be silent when every fiber of her being screamed, to be still when her instinct was to run, and to turn her back on the last good man who offered her a hand. Her survival was not a clean triumph. It was a messy, painful, and morally ambiguous victory won on the monster's terms. The ghosts of the Harper brothers are loud and bloody. They are simple tales of butchery and frontier justice. But the ghost of Sally Rice is the one that lingers. It's a quiet, unsettling whisper that asks the most difficult question of all. She escaped the devil, yes, she even outlived him. But when you are known to history only as the devil's wife, can you ever truly be free of his shadow? And that, my friends, is the chilling ballad of Sally Rice Harper. A reminder that when you're forced to live with monsters, the most terrifying question isn't whether you will survive, but what part of you will have to die in order to do so.